I never wanted to return to the place where everything in my life first began to splinter. But life has a way of dragging you back to the doors you once swore you would never open again. And I guess that is why at 36 years old, I found myself standing on the faded wooden porch of the house I grew up in, breathing in the same air that had once tasted like warmth and safety, and now felt thick with memories that clung to my skin like dew. I remember thinking how strange it was that the place you once called home could feel like a stranger, and even stranger still, that part of me was relieved to be there, as if some buried part of my chest had been waiting years for this moment to finally let go of all the weight I had carried. I was born in this house, raised by a mother who loved too silently and a father who loved too loudly, and when I left at 18 years old, I promised myself I would never live the kind of life they did. I would never be the woman who swallowed her voice to keep the peace. Never be the girl who apologized for things she didn't do. Never be the wife who stayed long after she should have run. But I suppose we all become what we fear when we're not paying attention, because somewhere between being a hopeful teenage girl and the woman I was now, something inside me cracked quietly enough that I didn't notice, and by the time I did, I didn't know how to fix it. I think that's why I'm telling this story now, because sometimes the most painful truths don't make sense until you speak them out loud, and this story, my story, is made of those kinds of truths. I was 36 when my marriage finally collapsed, but the unraveling started years before so slowly and subtly that I didn't even notice the threads coming loose, and if you had asked me back then what my life was like, I would have smiled and said I was fine, maybe even happy, because that is the dangerous thing about slow destruction. You don't realize the house is collapsing until the beams are already splitting. My name is Elena, and I am the kind of woman who learns her lessons too late, but once I learn them deeply. I married my husband Daniel when I was 26. Back then, he was charming in the way that made people lean in without realizing it, and he had this ability to make even the most ordinary days feel like something worth remembering. He wasn't the first man I dated, but he was the first man who made me feel seen, or at least that was what I believed at the time. I grew up with a father whose criticism could carve holes in your heart if you stood still long enough, and Daniel knew how to fill those holes with compliments that felt like sunlight on the days I needed warmth the most. It is only now, looking back, that I understand how easy it is to confuse validation with love, and how dangerous it is to let someone else tell you who you are. The early years with him were so good that I often question whether they were ever real or just a beautiful illusion I was desperate to believe in. He brought me breakfasts in bed on Sundays, left sticky notes with small affirmations on the bathroom mirror, kissed my forehead as if I were something fragile and precious. He made promises that sounded like forever promises I clung to, because I had never seen forever up close. I remember waking up beside him, sometimes studying his face while he slept, wondering how I had gotten so lucky to be loved this way. I didn't notice the small things that grew into big things. I didn't notice the way he corrected the way I spoke in front of his friends, as if my voice embarrassed him. I didn't notice the way he monitored the clothes I wore, telling me certain things didn't look flattering, steering me toward outfits that made me look softer, quieter, more manageable. I didn't notice the way he started to sigh when I mentioned my dreams of going back to school for psychology, or how he changed the subject every time I expressed wanting something that didn't include him at the center of it. I didn't notice the early signs because they were wrapped in excuses that sounded reasonable. He wasn't controlling. He was protective. He wasn't dismissive. He was stressed. He wasn't jealous. He just loved me so much. And I believed him because I thought love was supposed to hurt a little. Thought love meant compromise, even when the compromise carved away pieces of you. Looking back, I can trace the exact moment the first real fracture formed. It was a rainy evening, maybe 5 years into our marriage, and we were sitting in the kitchen arguing about something so small I can't even remember it now. The kind of argument couples have all the time. But what I do remember is the look on his face, the tightness around his jaw, the flicker of something sharp in his eyes as he told me I was being dramatic. That word dramatic stuck to my ribs like a bruise. It felt like the kind of word my father would have used, the kind of word meant to silence instead of understand. I brushed it off, told myself it didn't matter, but it did. It planted something inside me, a quiet little fear I didn't want to examine. Daniel apologized the next morning with flowers and breakfast, and that smile he knew softened me, and I pretended everything was fine. That became the rhythm of our marriage. Tiny wounds brushed aside, deeper wounds disguised as misunderstandings, a cycle of hurting and healing that always left me feeling smaller. And then came the betrayal, the one that didn't just crack me, but shattered me into pieces I didn't know how to gather. It didn't happen suddenly. Affairs rarely do. They creep in through small secrets, hidden messages, unexplained absences, and the kind of intuition you try to ignore, because acknowledging it would mean acknowledging the truth you are not ready to face. For months, I felt something shifting inside him, like he was retreating to a place I couldn't follow. He became distant in the way someone becomes distant when they have already left but haven't yet walked out the door. He started spending longer hours at work guarding his phone like it was a lifeline. When I asked him if something was wrong, he would sigh that same sigh from years ago and say he wished I would stop imagining problems that weren't there. For a while, I let myself believe him, because it was easier than believing the alternative. But the truth has a way of rising no matter how deeply you bury it. The night I discovered the messages, I felt something inside me go silent. Not break, not scream, just silent. The kind of silence that comes after a storm takes everything with it. He had left his phone in the living room, something he never did, and I don't know what made me pick it up. Maybe it was intuition, maybe it was desperation, maybe it was the version of me I used to be trying to save the version I had become. The screen lit up before I even unlocked it. A message from a woman whose name I had never heard, but whose words carved into me like ice. I miss you already. When are you coming back? I remember thinking the world should have stopped spinning in that moment, but instead it kept moving, as if my life had not just changed irreversibly. I read every message, every picture, every confession he had given her, the things he once told me now handed to someone else like spare change. And the worst part, the part that haunts me even now, was realizing how easily he spoke to her in ways he hadn't spoken to me in months. He wasn't tired. He wasn't stressed. He wasn't distant. He was in love with someone else. When he came home, I was sitting at the dining table with his phone in my hands. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw the phone at him. I wanted to collapse into sobs, but I did none of that. Instead, I looked at him with a calm I didn't recognize and said I knew. I remember the way his face shifted from confusion to guilt to anger all in a matter of seconds. He didn't apologize. He didn't fall to his knees begging for forgiveness. He told me it wasn't what I thought, even though I had read every detail. He told me I was overreacting. Dramatic. There was that word again, pulling me back into every wound I had ignored. That night was the first time he raised his voice at me in a way that made me step back. Not because he was going to hit me, but because I suddenly realized he was capable of it. I packed a bag the next morning, not because I was brave, but because staying felt like drowning. I drove to the only place I knew, the house I had run from years ago, the house I said I'd never return to. When my mother opened the door, she didn't ask questions. She just pulled me into her arms like she used to when I was a child, and I cried in a way I had not cried in years. It was in that house, that old house filled with the ghosts of my childhood, that I began to unravel the truth of my marriage, the truth of myself, the truth of the woman I had become. And it was there, in that creaking wooden bedroom that smelled like memory, that I discovered the family secret that would change everything, not just about my marriage, but about the bloodline I came from. A secret hidden for decades, buried under silence, waiting for the right moment to rise. A secret that would lead me to the path of revenge I never knew I had the strength to walk. And I walked it. God help me, I walked it. I wish I could tell you that returning to my childhood home brought clarity, that stepping back into the familiar creaking floors and fading wallpaper gave me sudden answers. But the truth is that it only stirred questions I had spent my entire life avoiding, questions about who I was, who my parents really were, and what kind of generational wounds were woven so tightly through our bloodline that I ended up repeating patterns I once swore I would never repeat. Every morning in that house felt like waking inside an old memory, one that changed shape depending on where I stood or how long I let myself look at it. I slept in my old bedroom the first few nights, surrounded by posters from high school I had never taken down, surrounded by the ghosts of the girl I used to be. The girl who dreamed boldly but lived quietly. The girl who never fought back, because she was always just trying not to make things worse. For the first time in years, I had no husband to walk around, no voice to silence, no fear to swallow, and the stillness of that freedom scared me. My mother noticed. Of course she did. She was always the type to read emotions, the way some people read books, silently but completely. And though she never pushed me to talk, she lingered a little longer in doorways the first week, studying me, the way a gardener studies a plant she isn't sure will survive the winter. She would bring me tea in the mornings, set it on the nightstand beside me, and leave without a word. And those small acts of care made something ache inside me, because I realized how long it had been since someone tended to me without obligation or resentment. It took 3 days before I finally told her everything, sitting with her in the dim kitchen as the sound of the old refrigerator hummed loudly in the background. I told her about the affair, about the lies, about the way Daniel had twisted my reality, until I no longer trusted my own thoughts. I expected anger from her, or sympathy, or maybe even advice. But instead, she simply whispered my name and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen since childhood, a mix of sorrow and recognition, as if she were looking at a reflection instead of a daughter. That look stayed with me long after the conversation ended, stayed with me as I lay awake that night, listening to the wind rattle the windows, and the next morning when I finally gathered the courage to ask her what it meant, her entire body stiffened. She asked me what exactly I wanted to know, and when I asked her if Dad had ever hurt her the way Daniel hurt me, she didn't answer. Not with words, anyway. Instead, she turned her face away, and in that small movement, that tiny flinch, I felt the answer settle into my bones. Yes. Yes, he had. Maybe not in the exact same ways, maybe not with the same patterns, but the pain had echoed, the silence had repeated, the wounds had passed down like heirlooms no one wanted to inherit. And in that moment, the betrayal of my marriage became something bigger, heavier, almost ancient, as if I weren't just grieving Daniel, but grieving the entire lineage of women in my family who learned to love in the shadows of men who mistook dominance for devotion. I felt angry at him, yes, but I also felt angry at her, angry that she stayed angry, that she never warned me, angry, that she let me grow up thinking her silence was normal. Angry that she let me believe love was something you endured rather than something that nourished you. She apologized for not telling me sooner, but her voice trembled with the kind of guilt that sits in a person for decades, and she admitted that she had once tried to leave my father but found herself unable to, paralyzed by the same fears that had kept me tied to Daniel for far too long. I asked her what finally made her stay permanently, and she said the same sentence that had lived inside me for years without me ever realizing. She said, "I thought things would get better one day." They never did. There was something about hearing her say it out loud that made the air in the room feel thinner, as though the truth had pulled something heavy from the walls. And then she told me there was more. She told me there were things about our family, about our past, that she had kept from me, not because she wanted to lie, but because she believed the past would stay buried as long as no one disturbed it. But the past never stays buried. It waits. It waits for the moment you are most vulnerable, the moment you are finally willing to look directly at it. I asked her what she meant, and she hesitated, her fingers gripping the ceramic mug so tightly I thought it might crack. She told me the truth about my father's temper, about the nights she had hidden in my room after he'd stormed through the house like a thunderstorm, and she told me the truth about the arguments I used to hear when I was too young to understand what pain looked like behind closed doors. Then she told me the thing she had never told another soul, the thing that made my stomach twist. She told me that my father had been unfaithful too, not once, not twice, but for years, with a woman she never met, but knew existed from the small clues he never bothered to hide. She told me that she confronted him once long before I was born, and he had laughed, not denied it, but laughed, told her she was lucky he came home at all. Hearing that sentence, knowing that Daniel had once told me something almost identical, made it feel like history was folding in on itself. Like I had stepped into the same river my mother once drowned in without realizing. But then she told me something else, something I hadn't expected, something that changed the course of everything that followed. She told me that after she confronted him, after she told him she knew my father had left for a week, angry and self-righteous, and when he returned, he wasn't alone. There was a child with him. A child he claimed wasn't his, but whom he brought home anyway, claiming the child's mother had died, claiming no one else would take her. A little girl. A little girl with his eyes. A little girl I never knew existed. My half-sister. My mother told me she raised that little girl for 2 years before the child was taken away by relatives from the other side of the family, and my father acted as though the entire episode had never happened. She told me she had tried to tell me when I was older, but each time she tried, the fear of reopening old wounds kept her silent. That revelation hit me like a punch, not because I was angry about the existence of a half-sister I never met, but because it showed me just how deeply betrayal was sewn into the fabric of my bloodline. I sat there stunned, unable to move, unable to speak, feeling the weight of generations pressing down on me. My father's affairs, his temper, his manipulation, all the ways he made my mother feel small, all the ways he taught me unintentionally that this was what love looked like, all of it suddenly aligned with the man I married. The same cycle, the same script, the same wounds repeated in different bodies, and once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. That was the moment revenge stopped being a fantasy, whispered in my pain, and became a plan forming in my mind with a clarity that frightened me. I wasn't just fighting Daniel anymore. I was fighting every man who had ever believed they could break a woman and walk away without consequence. The very next day, I drove back to my marital home not to speak to him, but to gather evidence. My hands shook as I unlocked the door, because part of me still expected him to be there. Expected him to demand explanations. Expected the version of him I once loved to appear and beg. But he wasn't home. And the quietness felt wrong, like stepping into an abandoned stage where a violent performance had just finished. I walked through the room, slowly touching nothing at first, letting the memories of the life I thought we had wash over me, memories that now felt hollow and scripted. I found the bills he had hidden from me, financial secrets he thought I'd never find. I found hotel receipts, emails he forgot to delete, messages that made it clear his betrayal was not a mistake, but a choice. And then I found something else, something that made my blood run cold. A hidden envelope addressed to a woman with the same last name I had never seen before. A woman who lived only a few towns away. And inside the envelope was a picture of Daniel, holding a little girl who looked exactly like him. Exactly. The same eyes, the same smile, the same dimples. My husband had a child with another woman, and he had kept it secret for years. The betrayal was no longer emotional, no longer romantic. It reached into the core of who he was, and it made something inside me snap so cleanly I felt the break. Suddenly, everything my mother had told me about my father's infidelities crystallized before me. Suddenly, I understood why fate had pulled me back to that old house, why I had been forced to look at generational wounds I never wanted to see. It wasn't just coincidence. It was a warning. And now that I had proof, I knew exactly how I would destroy Daniel. Not out of spite, not out of pettiness, but out of necessity. Because men like him only learn lessons when the ground collapses beneath them. And I was done being the woman holding the ground steady. I left that house knowing exactly what I had to do. And I did it. God help me, I did it. I wish I could tell you that the plan came to me gently, that I sat down and mapped it out like a calm strategist with clarity and patience. But the truth is that it arrived like a tidal wave, violent and unstoppable, a rush of instinct and rage and clarity all at once, as if every woman in my bloodline whispered the same sentence in my ear enough. And I realized then that revenge is not always born from hatred. Sometimes it is born from survival, from the need to reclaim pieces of yourself someone else tried to break, and as I drove away from that house, holding the picture of the child. Daniel never told me about a child with his exact eyes. I felt years of silence inside me begin to roar. I did not want to hurt the child, of course not. She was innocent. But I knew that the truth about her existence was the wound that would shatter the man who tried to shatter me. I did not rush into confrontation. Instead, I spent the next week gathering everything I needed, evidence he never imagined I would find, evidence that would unravel him from the inside out. I found bank statements that led to payments he sent to the other woman. I found receipts for gifts that never reached my hands. I found messages written late at night confessing love to someone else while I slept beside him unaware. And I found the address of the woman he had built a secret life with, a life that mirrored the one he pretended to build with me. The night I decided to face her, I sat in my childhood bedroom staring at my reflection in the mirror, not recognizing the woman looking back. She looked older, harder, sharper, but she also looked awake for the first time in years, and I realized then that waking up is painful, because you have to see the truth without the comfort of illusions. My mother wanted to come with me. She could tell I was planning something, but I told her I needed to do this alone, not because I wanted to protect her, but because I needed to reclaim the voice I had lost. The address led me to a small beige house on the edge of town, quiet and unassuming, the kind you drive past without noticing. But the moment I stepped onto the porch, I felt my heart pounding in my throat, not from fear, but from the realization that this moment would divide my life into before and after. When she opened the door, I recognized her instantly from the photos on Daniel's phone. She was beautiful in a soft, unsuspecting way, the kind of woman who laughed easily and trusted fully, and for a moment I felt sorry for her because she too had been woven into Daniel's web of lies. She hesitated when she saw me, her eyes narrowing slightly, then widening in recognition when I said my name. I could tell by her expression that Daniel had spoken about me, but not kindly. She motioned for me to come inside, and when I stepped into her living room, I saw the little girl sitting on the floor, drawing with crayons, and everything inside me went silent. She looked up at me with the same exact eyes Daniel had, the same dimples, the same lopsided smile when she realized a stranger was watching her, and something twisted painfully in my chest, because she deserved better than to be born into deception. The woman introduced herself quietly, and I told her why I was there. She paled instantly. She had no idea Daniel was still married. She had no idea he had made the same promises to me that he made to her. She had no idea she was living inside the shadow of another woman's life. We talked for nearly 2 hours, trading stories, comparing timelines, unraveling the web he had spun between us, and with every detail she shared, the anger inside me sharpened. I learned that he has told her he was divorced, that he was rebuilding his life, that he wanted to marry her once things settled. I learned that he spent holidays with them when he claimed to be on work trips. I learned that he had created an entirely separate identity when he was with her, an identity built on lies designed to keep both of us trapped in different versions of his fantasy. And then she told me something that nearly broke me. She told me he had promised the little girl that he would take her to the beach for her 10th birthday. The same promise he had made to me years ago, the same promise he had broken every single year. Hearing that made something shift in me. I realized then that revenge was not just about punishing him, it was about liberating every woman he had manipulated. And so the woman and I did something neither of us expected. We joined forces. Together we gathered the final pieces of evidence, documenting everything with precision, preparing not just for a confrontation, but for a dismantling so complete that he would never again have the power to harm another woman. The day we confronted him felt eerily calm, like the air before a storm. We met in the park near the lake, a neutral place where neither of us held home advantage. She stood beside me holding her daughter's hand, and I felt an unexpected surge of protectiveness toward the child. When Daniel arrived and saw both of us standing together, the color drained from his face. His shock was almost satisfying, the way his eyes darted between us, searching for an escape, realizing too late there was none. He tried to speak, tried to explain, tried to spin lies the way he always did. But for the first time, I saw fear behind his anger, fear behind his arrogance, fear in the realization that he was no longer controlling the narrative. I told him everything, every detail I had uncovered, every message I had read, every receipt, every lie, every betrayal. And with each truth I spoke aloud, I felt a piece of my strength return. The other woman confronted him too, her voice trembling not with weakness but with fury. She told him he had broken her trust, broken their family, broken their daughter's sense of stability, and I watched as Daniel crumbled under the truth. He begged. He cried. He tried to shift blame. But neither of us bent. Neither of us softened. And when we walked away from him, leaving him alone with the ruins of his own choices, I felt something inside me settle for the first time in years. But the story didn't end there. Revenge rarely ends with confrontation. It ends with reconstruction. It ends with choosing yourself after years of choosing someone who only chose themselves. The weeks that followed were filled with court filings, financial disclosures, and uncomfortable truths he could no longer hide. His secrets came to the surface like oil rising through water, undeniable and slick and ugly. Our divorce became public, his double life exposed, and he lost nearly everything he once used to keep me small. His reputation shattered, his finances drained, his family distanced themselves from him. And for the first time, he had to look at the wreckage not as a victim, but as the architect of his own downfall. And yet even then, even after everything, the part of me that once loved him ached. Healing is cruel that way. It asks you to grieve someone who wounded you. It asks you to sit with memories that still feel warm even after the person who created them turned cold. But healing also asks you to move forward. And I did. Slowly, quietly, painfully. I went back to school. I started therapy, the kind that makes you dig into childhood wounds you once pretended didn't matter. I learned that my patterns were inherited, passed down like stories whispered in the dark, and I learned how to break them piece by piece. My mother healed too in her own way. She apologized for her silence, but I realized she had been just as trapped as I was, fighting battles she didn't have the tools to win. And in her own healing, she found the courage to reclaim parts of herself she had buried for decades. As for the other woman, she and I maintained a bond that feels strange to explain, but sacred to experience. Trauma binds people in ways nothing else can, and together we rebuilt our lives from the ashes of a man who tried to burn us both. Her daughter grew to know me as someone safe, someone who did not lie, someone who saw her as a person instead of a secret. And in a way, I never expected, we became a strange kind of family, not bound by blood, bound by truth, bound by survival. I often look back now and try to pinpoint the exact moment I became the woman who finally fought back instead of the girl who stayed silent. Maybe it was in my mother's kitchen hearing truths that changed everything. Maybe it was finding the photo of the child Daniel hid. Maybe it was standing beside another betrayed woman facing the man who deceived us both. Or maybe it was all of it layered one on top of another until I had no choice but to rise. Healing is not linear, revenge is not pretty, but both are transformative. And if there is one thing I know now, one thing I hope you hear in every word I have shared, it is this: you can rebuild, you can rise, you can break the cycle, you can become the version of yourself you always needed but never believed you could be. And if my story resonates with you in any way, if you see pieces of yourself in my silence, in my unraveling, in my awakening, then please remember you are not alone. And you deserve a life where love does not hurt and trust does not bleed and home does not feel like a battlefield. If this story moved you, if it made you feel seen or understood or less alone, please like this video, share it with someone who might need it. Subscribe for more stories of strength and healing, and tell me in the comments how this story touched you. Your voice matters here.